The fog lay heavy on the Seine that morning, a pale curtain muffling the sound of cartwheels and footsteps along the cobbled embankment. A barge moved slowly upriver, its lantern throwing a jaundiced glow upon the rippling water, and from the shadows of the Quai des Orfèvres one could sense the city holding its breath. Somewhere beyond the bridges a train whistled, distant yet insistent, as though carrying with it some unspoken secret. It was in this charged stillness that the first whisper reached Inspector Maigret. A carriage that never stopped, a woman glimpsed behind its glass, and a silence more troubling than any cry for help. Already Paris seemed to lean toward the mystery, each alley and café ready to yield a scrap of rumour, a suggestion of scandal, a clue half concealed in smoke. If you wished to walk with Maigret through the fog, to hear the muted echoes of the city and sense the pulse of a case that unsettled even the most jaded policeman of the quay, then I invite you to stay with us until the end, and if this atmosphere draws you in, let it carry you further. Subscribe, share this journey, and keep the lantern lit for the stories yet to come. The fog had come down over Paris like a heavy curtain, clinging to the riverbanks and softening the lamps along the quay into blurred halos of yellow. From his office window at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret had watched it gather thicker with every passing hour until the bridges seemed to vanish into whiteness and the far side of the Seine disappeared altogether. The city was muffled, its usual murmur reduced to occasional footsteps echoing hollowly on the wet stones, or the hollow thud of a cart horse's hooves, swallowed almost at once by the mist. It was not unusual for Paris to drown in fog at this time of year, yet there was something different about this one, something dense, conspiratorial, as though it had secrets to conceal. He had been at his desk since early morning, pipe smoke mingling with the damp chill that crept through the old windows, when Janvier entered with a hesitant knock. The young inspector's collar was wet, his hair glistened with fog droplets, and his expression carried that peculiar unease which Maigret could read before a single word was spoken. Janvier did not rush. He stood for a moment, as if reluctant to disturb the silence of the office, then placed his hat on the chair and said in a low voice that something odd had been reported from the night patrols. A carriage, he explained, had been sighted moving at impossible hours along the Rue des Carmes and later crossing the Pont Neuf. Not unusual in itself, but it was the manner of its passage that troubled those who saw it. The wheels seemed to make no sound on the cobbles, the coachman kept his face turned away, and behind the drawn curtains there had been, or so claimed one watchman, the pale oval of a woman's face, perfectly still, framed by darkness. Maigret leaned back, pipey in hand, studying Janvier's account with the slow attentiveness of a man who measured not just the facts but the weight of silence between them. He asked no immediate questions. He let the picture form first, the fog swallowing the street lamps, the hollow streets, and this carriage gliding like a phantom across the bridges. When he did speak, his tone was even, almost indifferent, yet his eyes narrowed behind the smoke. Had the watchman been drinking? Janvier shook his head. The man was known for sobriety, not imagination. Another patrolman, further along the quays, had also remarked on the strangeness, a vehicle passing without sound, as if cushioned by the mist itself. Outside, a barge whistled as it nosed along the river, and the sound seemed to underline the odd stillness of the story. Maigret tapped his pipe against the ashtray, rose heavily, and crossed to the window. The fog pressed against the glass, an impenetrable wall. For a moment he fancied he could see, out of the corner of his eye, the blurred outline of a carriage lantern sliding across the opposite quay. But when he looked directly, there was nothing. Perhaps it was imagination, or perhaps the fog itself was playing tricks. He put on his overcoat, reached for his hat, and told Janvier they would walk. The streets near the quay were deserted at this hour. Shop fronts were shuttered. Cafes showed only the dim glow of a single kerosene lamp within. The wet stones gleamed like fish scales. Somewhere a bell tolled, muted and directionless in the mist. They crossed the Pont Saint-Michel, Maigret's heavy figure moving with deliberate calm, pipe smoke mingling with the fog, while Janvier kept a step behind, his eyes darting nervously at each sound that seemed to emerge from nowhere. At the corner of Rue des Carmes they found the watchman, an older fellow with a cap pulled low, who repeated his account with the stubborn certainty of one who knew what he had seen. The carriage had come from the direction of the Jardin des Plantes, rolling as if guided by an invisible hand, its curtains drawn tight save for a fleeting glimpse of a pale profile. It had not hurried, nor slowed, but moved with a dreadful composure, and when it passed, the silence seemed to deepen. Maigret listened, said nothing, only nodded slowly. He asked for the precise time, the weather, the sounds, and filed each answer away without judgment. As they stood there, the fog thickened further, swirling like smoke from an invisible fire. Maigret's gaze turned toward the river, though nothing could be seen beyond arm's length. What struck him was not the detail of the story, but the mood it evoked, the kind of detail that burrowed under the skin and stayed there. He had known enough false alarms, enough drunken tales of ghosts and apparitions to distrust first impressions, yet this had the flavor of something different, something persistent. They moved on, retracing the route the carriage was said to have taken. Along the Quai de la Tournelle, the street lamps glowed faintly like drowned stars. The city seemed deserted, though once they heard the faint rattle of dishes from a café where the proprietor was cleaning before closing. Maigret stopped there, ordered a glass of brandy, and asked the man casually whether he had seen a carriage pass in the night. The proprietor shrugged, wiped his hands, and hesitated just long enough for Maigret to notice. Yes, he said. There had been a carriage, but he could not describe it. He seemed reluctant, as if speaking of it might invite some misfortune. Maigret paid, left the glass half-finished, and walked out without comment. By the time they returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, the lamps of dawn were already paling behind the fog, giving the sky a milky, featureless hue. In his office, Maigret removed his coat, hung it on the hook, and stood for a moment staring at the map of Paris pinned to the wall. His pipe had gone out. He relit it slowly, eyes fixed not on the streets marked there, but on the empty spaces between them. Janvier waited expectant, shifting from one foot to the other. Maigret finally spoke, almost to himself. A carriage that passes without stopping, a woman behind the curtain who does not move, silence following in its wake. Was it a trick of the fog, or something else? He did not answer his own question. The hours that followed were filled with the ordinary rhythms of police life, reports, telegrams, visits from subordinates, yet the image of the carriage lingered like smoke that refuses to disperse. More than once he caught himself gazing at the window, half expecting to see through the whiteness the blurred shape of lanterns gliding by. He knew it was foolish. He knew, too, that foolish impressions sometimes mark the beginning of truths no one else had dared to name. That evening, as the fog still pressed against the city, Maigret walked home slowly through the narrow streets. Madame Maigret was waiting with supper, the familiar warmth of their apartment a balm against the damp chill. He ate in silence, then stretched in his armchair with a glass of beer, pipe smoke curling lazily. He did not speak of the carriage, yet in his mind the image remained, a pale face behind the glass, motionless, as if carved from ivory, and a silence more telling than a scream. He knew this was only the beginning. Paris was restless, and the fog was thick with secrets, and so, long after the city had sunk into uneasy sleep, Inspector Maigret sat by his window, pipe glowing faintly in the dark, waiting for the soundless wheels to pass once more. By the following morning, the fog had thinned, but not dispersed. It drifted in slow veils over the Seine, torn apart here and there by a gust of wind, only to gather again in the hollows of the city. From the office windows at the Quai des Orfèvres, the rooftops appeared softened, indistinct, as if Paris itself were a sketch left half-finished. Maigret sat, heavy in his chair, pipe clamped between his teeth, eyes fixed not on the paperwork before him, but on the dim memory of a pale oval face glimpsed through a curtain. The account of the watchman had followed him through the night, and now it clung to the air of the office like smoke. Lucas came in first, brisk, efficient, dropping reports onto the desk with the casualness of a man who had long ago ceased to expect thanks. There had been inquiries made, no carriage reported stolen, no complaints from livery stables. Yet, as Lucas pointed out, carriages of that kind were still to be found in certain quarters, often rented out for funerals or discreet excursions. He spoke without drama, yet behind his words lay the faint suggestion that this was not a ghostly apparition but something stubbornly real. Not long after, Janvier returned, his youthful eagerness sharpened by a night spent chasing rumours. He had spoken to another witness, a rag-picker, who swore he had seen the woman's face more clearly. She had been seated close to the glass, unmoving, her features blurred by mist but unmistakably pale, her expression devoid of life. The rag-picker insisted she had not blinked, not stirred, and it was this uncanny stillness that unnerved him more than anything. He had crossed himself afterwards, muttering about ill omens, and refused further questions. Maigret listened, puffing steadily, his eyes narrowing at the description. A woman in a carriage was not remarkable. What troubled him was the unanimity of impression. Each witness, though vague on detail, had been struck by the same unsettling image, a presence that was less presence than apparition, a face half-revealed yet stubbornly indelible. By noon, the cafes along the Boulevard Saint-Germain were buzzing with talk. Paris thrived on rumour, and in the absence of hard news, the city invented its own. Waiters carried trays of coffee while leaning in to whisper to patrons. Students gestured dramatically, describing the ghostly carriage gliding past Notre Dame. Shopkeepers retold the story to customers as if they themselves had witnessed it. Maigret, strolling slowly with his collar turned up, could hear the variations ripple through the air. Some claimed the woman was a corpse, propped upright by a sinister coachman. Others insisted she was an heiress held against her will, or a mistress whisked away from scandal. The more fanciful spoke of a foreign princess fleeing some political intrigue. Each retelling embroidered the tale further, until it seemed the entire city was colluding in the birth of a legend. He entered one of the smoky cafes, chose a table near the back, and ordered a beer. The warmth inside was oppressive, heavy with the smell of wet coats steaming near the stove. Two men at the next table were arguing, one swearing that he had seen the carriage himself, the other scoffing, insisting it was an invention of bored policemen. Maigret sat silently listening, pipe unlit in his hand. He had no desire to correct them. He preferred to let the story unfold on its own, to see how far rumour would carry it. The truth, when it emerged, would be found not in the exaggerations, but in the small, overlooked details left behind. Later that afternoon, a telegram arrived from a station-master at Melun. A carriage, matching the description, had been seen near the tracks at dawn, the woman inside again, motionless, staring out of the window, with that same pale stillness. The station master added that the carriage had not stopped to board any train. It had lingered as if observing, then rolled away without sound. The report was brief, formal, yet between the lines Maigret detected unease, the kind that made practical men hesitate before committing words to paper. He spent the evening questioning his own instincts. Was it possible that Paris had conjured a phantom out of nothing? The city had a genius for illusions, for turning chance sightings into melodrama. And yet the persistence of the image, the woman at the window staring out without motion, nagged at him. It was not the kind of detail witnesses invented. It was the kind they remembered against their will, carried with them like a stone in the pocket. That night, walking home through the damp streets, Maigret passed along the boulevard de Sébastopol, where gas lamps flickered uncertainly in the mist. A carriage rattled by, ordinary enough, its wheels clattering on the stones, the driver hunched against the cold. Yet for a moment, as the curtains shifted, he thought he saw a pale face peering out, and his heart gave a slow, heavy thump. He turned, watching until it disappeared around the corner. Perhaps it had been nothing. Perhaps he was already infected by the city's fever of imagination. But he could not shake the impression that the face he had seen was not one of curiosity or fear, but resignation, as if the woman were enduring something inevitable. At home, Madame Maigret noticed his distraction. She placed supper before him, a simple stew fragrant with onions, and remarked that he looked as though the fog had followed him indoors. He smiled faintly, reassured by her presence, but when she pressed him, he merely said there was talk of a strange carriage. She shook her head, half amused, half indulgent, and told him Paris loved its mysteries, that it was probably nothing more than a tale to pass the time. Still, she touched his hand lightly as if to steady him, sensing that this tale weighed differently upon him than most. As the clock struck 11, Maigret sat once more by the window, pipe glowing faintly, eyes scanning the street below. The fog moved in swirls, pale and luminous in the lamplight, and every distant rattle of wheels sent a tremor of expectation through him. When at last a carriage did appear, ordinary and harmless, he felt both relief and disappointment. The phantom had not come. Yet the city outside seemed to hold its breath, waiting, as if it too expected the woman at the window to return. And Maigret, though unwilling to admit it even to himself, knew he was waiting as well. Waiting for the silent carriage to pass once more, and for the pale, unblinking eyes to meet his through the curtain. The following morning, Paris awoke beneath a grey lid of cloud. The fog dispersed, yet leaving behind an air of fatigue, as though the city itself had not slept well. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the hum of typewriters already filled the corridors, telephones rang with sharp insistence, and the shuffle of clerks' feet echoed along stone floors polished by decades of passage. Within those walls the rhythms of the police never ceased, indifferent to the weather, though each case lent its own undercurrent to the daily monotony. That day it was the carriage, the woman, the silence that threaded itself into every whispered conversation, every scrap of paper arriving on Maigret's desk. He entered slowly, heavy overcoat unbuttoned, hat dripping faintly with drizzle. His office smelled of damp wool, stale tobacco, and yesterday's ashes still resting in the tray. Janvier and Lucas were already there, their reports spread out untidily, faces alert but tense. A telegram had come from Dijon, brief but disquieting. A carriage of the same description had been glimpsed near the station 2 nights earlier, moving without apparent destination. Witnesses spoke again of a woman's face, pale, expressionless, framed by curtains. Maigret sank into his chair, pipe between his teeth, and read the telegram twice, the words stark in their bureaucratic phrasing, yet carrying with them the same unease that had followed him for days. He asked no immediate questions. He let the silence stretch, his eyes drifting to the window where rain streaked down the glass, blurring the view of the river. In that silence his men shifted restlessly, waiting for his judgment, knowing that Maigret preferred to let facts simmer until they revealed their flavor. The press had already caught wind. Before noon, a journalist from Le Matin appeared at the desk, his overcoat collar turned high, notebook in hand, eager for confirmation. Maigret received him with his habitual stone-faced courtesy, offering neither denial nor embellishment. He knew too well how the press thrived on mystery, and how their hunger could both serve and hinder. A careless phrase might fan speculation into frenzy. A careful pause might let the city believe more than he intended. When the journalist finally left, his pen scratching furiously, Maigret lit his pipe anew and murmured that soon the entire city would be seeing phantom carriages. Still the reports continued to arrive. Clerks entered with slips of paper, policemen called in from suburban stations, telegrams clattered in from provincial towns. Each fragment added to the growing mosaic, though none formed a picture. The carriage moved through Paris like a rumour-given flesh, leaving impressions, but no trace. Some swore it was black with brass fittings, others claimed dark green, some insisted on a pair of horses, others a single grey. Yet always there was the woman at the window, pale, motionless, eyes fixed on nothing. That detail never altered. In the late afternoon, Maigret summoned Janvier and Lucas to sit with him, not as subordinates, but as companions in puzzlement. He poured them each a glass of brandy from the bottle he kept in the cabinet, the warmth of the liquor easing the damp chill that seemed to settle even inside the office walls. He spoke slowly, weighing each word, sketching aloud the contradictions. Why did the carriage not stop? Why did the woman never move? Why were its appearances reported across such distances in so short a span? Could it be more than one carriage, more than one woman, an illusion born of repetition? He asked these questions not expecting answers, but to hear them in the air, to feel their weight. Lucas, pragmatic as ever, suggested that someone might be using the carriage as a diversion, a theatrical device to distract attention from other affairs. Janvier, more imaginative, wondered aloud if the woman were a prisoner, displayed like a doll to frighten or unsettle. Maigret listened without dismissing either theory. He knew that truth often lay between practicality and fantasy, shaded by both. He puffed at his pipe, watching the smoke curl toward the ceiling, and thought again of the silence that seemed to follow the carriage. Silence was rarely innocent. By evening, his office was thick with smoke and fatigue. The typewriters clattered less frequently, clerks gathered their coats, footsteps echoed toward the stairwell. Yet Maigret remained at his desk, heavy shoulders hunched, eyes half closed, as if listening to something distant. The river murmured outside, swollen with rain, carrying with it the debris of the city. He imagined the carriage gliding along some deserted quay, lanterns dimmed, the woman staring blankly through the mist. He imagined, too, the city itself watching, complicit, its cafes and alleys alive with gossip, its very stones echoing with rumour. At 9 o'clock, weary but unwilling to leave, he called for coffee. The young clerk who brought it hesitated before leaving, as if he too wished to speak. Finally, in a rush of words, he confessed that his aunt in Montreuil had sworn she had seen the carriage passing slowly by her street just after midnight. Maigret nodded, thanked him, said nothing more. But when the door closed, he smiled faintly, for he recognized in the clerk's voice the same tremor of awe that rumour instilled in all who touched it. Later still, when the corridors had emptied and the lamps cast long shadows across the floor, Maigret rose, stretched his heavy limbs and walked to the window. The Seine gleamed under the dim glow of gaslight, rain stippling its surface. Somewhere across the river a whistle blew, long and mournful, and for an instant he fancied it was the cry of the carriage wheels. He remained there, motionless, pipe embers glowing like a small beacon in the dark, until the sound faded. He returned to his desk, opened the drawer, and withdrew a small notebook. It was his habit, though rarely known to others, to jot impressions not fit for official reports, fragments of mood, gestures, the intangible details that made up the marrow of a case. In neat, steady script he wrote, "Carriage, woman at the window, silence after passage, not ghostly, too persistent. Faces of witnesses all struck by same unease. Pattern of movement irregular but deliberate. Feels like message or warning." He closed the notebook, slid it back into the drawer, and extinguished his pipe. When at last he left the Quai des Orfèvres, the city was quiet. Streets slick with rain, the air heavy with damp. His footsteps echoed along the pavement as he crossed the Pont Neuf, the lamps gleaming faintly in the drizzle. In the distance he thought he heard wheels, the faintest rattle of iron rims on stone. He stopped, listening, heart slowed to the rhythm of the sound. But the street behind him was empty, the fog swallowing all. He walked on, collar raised, lips pursed around the cold stem of his pipe. At home, Madame Maigret looked up from her sewing, smiled at him with warmth undimmed by his lateness. He kissed her cheek, ate the soup she had kept warm, drank his beer in silence. She asked no questions, she never did. Yet as he sat in his armchair afterward, pipe smoke drifting lazily upward, he felt her eyes on him, steady and kind, as though she sensed that he carried within him a weight that words could not easily bear. He did not tell her of the telegrams, of the witnesses, of the growing unease at the quay. He merely sat, staring at the dark window, listening for the soundless wheels that seemed to move always, just beyond hearing. The case had not yet taken shape, but already it possessed him, wrapping itself around his thoughts like the fog that clung to the river. He knew sleep would not come easily, and in the silence of the night, when all Paris lay hushed, he would still be waiting, pipe glowing faintly in the dark, for the phantom carriage to pass once more. Montmartre had always held for Maigret a peculiar duality. By day it was a hill, crowned with churches and narrow stairways where children played and housewives haggled in the markets. By night it became something else entirely, a tangle of smoky cafes, dubious music halls and stairwells that seemed to lead nowhere but deeper into shadows. It was here, among the sloping streets and painted facades, that his search brought him in the days following the first reports of the carriage. A name had been whispered, no more than a breath of gossip in a café near the Boulevard de Clichy, of a foreign gentleman who had been seen stepping from a dark carriage in the company of a woman with veiled face. The gentleman had not lingered, but his presence had left behind the faint odour of money, the kind of impression that clung even after he had gone. It was late afternoon when Maigret arrived, the air damp with the residue of an earlier shower. The pavement glistened beneath the weak glow of the lamps, and posters pasted on walls, half torn, half faded, advertised songs and performances already forgotten. He entered the café with his usual heaviness, shoulders hunched beneath his overcoat, pipe smoke preceding him like a familiar aura. Inside, the atmosphere struck him at once, the sour scent of wine, the sharp tang of tobacco, the off-key tinkle of a piano played by a bored musician who barely lifted his eyes from the keys. Patrons sat scattered at small tables, their faces half hidden by smoke, voices pitched low, as though secrecy were the common currency of the place. He ordered a glass of red, set his hat on the chair beside him, and let his gaze wander slowly, not in search of anyone in particular, but to absorb the rhythm of the room. He knew that in places like this it was useless to arrive with blunt questions, better to sit, to drink slowly, to listen, and to allow the cafe itself to speak through the hesitations of its patrons. His pipe glowed softly, and in the silence between piano notes he caught the fragments of conversation drifting from nearby tables. A woman laughed too loudly, masking nerves. A man muttered of money owed. Another voice, more cautious, remarked that the gentleman had been foreign, perhaps from Central Europe, though he spoke French without accent. Maigret did not turn his head. He simply let the words soak into him like rain into stone. After a time, the proprietor came over, wiping his hands on a cloth. He was a stout man with a sheen of sweat on his forehead, eyes darting from Maigret's face to the insignia of authority barely concealed by his overcoat. Maigret asked for another glass, and when it was poured, he remarked casually about the weather, about the fog that had lingered for days. Only later, when the man seemed at ease, did he mention the carriage. The reaction was immediate, though carefully suppressed. A flicker in the eyes, a hesitation of the cloth in his hand. He shrugged, said many carriages passed through Montmartre, especially at night, and who could notice them all? But his tone betrayed him, and Maigret noted it silently, filing it away. An hour passed. The piano fell silent, the musician departing with a curt nod, leaving behind an air of fatigue. One by one, the patrons slipped out into the night, until the cafe grew quieter, the lamps burning low. It was then that a young woman approached Maigret's table. She wore a cheap dress and too much perfume, but her eyes were sharp, restless. She asked, in a voice pitched carefully low, whether he was looking for the gentleman. Maigret lifted his gaze slowly, studied her without expression. She told him that she had seen him, tall and well-dressed, entering the cafe 2 nights before, accompanied by a woman whose face was veiled, though the pallor of her hands had been startling against the dark fabric. They had stayed only a short while, speaking in murmurs, before leaving again in the same carriage. She could not say where they went, but the silence of their departure had chilled her, as though they had carried away something of the cafe's breath. Maigret thanked her, offered no money, no promise, merely a grave nod. He knew such testimony was fragile, coloured by imagination, yet the consistency of the detail, the veiled woman, the foreign gentleman, strengthened its weight. He finished his glass, rose with deliberate calm, and left the café, the damp air of Montmartre closing around him like a cloak. Outside, the streets were alive with their own peculiar music, the shouts of vendors, the clatter of hooves, the laughter of revellers spilling from dance halls. Yet through it all, Maigret felt the pulse of something hidden, a secret carried in whispers, in glances exchanged across smoky tables. He walked slowly down toward Pigalle, his pipe glowing faintly, and considered the portrait forming in his mind, a man of means, discreet yet careless enough to draw notice, a woman concealed but unforgettable in her stillness. The carriage was no phantom. It was flesh and wood and horse, and it had chosen Montmartre as one of its stages. He paused at the corner of Rue Lepic, watching the slow ascent of the funicular, its lamps swaying gently in the mist. The city stretched below him, a sea of rooftops and chimneys, from which smoke rose in languid spirals. Somewhere down there, in the maze of streets, the carriage moved again, carrying its silent passenger. He felt the weight of inevitability pressing on him, the certainty that this was not a chance encounter, but the edge of a design he had yet to grasp. That night, back at the Quai des Orfèvres, he spoke little of what he had heard. He noted only the essentials: foreign gentleman, veiled woman, Montmartre café. Janvier pressed for details. Lucas scoffed at the unreliability of café gossip, but Maigret waved them off. He knew better than to dismiss such impressions. They were the fibres that, woven together, made the fabric of truth. He sat long in his chair after they had gone, pipe smoke curling toward the ceiling, and thought again of the woman's pale hands, the hush that followed the carriage. When he finally left for home, the streets were quieter, rain having driven most indoors. He walked slowly along the quays, the river dark and swollen beside him, and he wondered, not for the first time, whether the woman behind the curtain looked out at the city as he did now, searching for something beyond the fog. Perhaps she too longed for escape, or perhaps she was already resigned to her role in whatever drama bound her to that silent carriage. At home, Madame Maigret asked about his day. He answered with a tired smile, saying only that he had walked in Montmartre. She served him a slice of pie, poured him a small glass of brandy, and let him sit in silence. He smoked, stared at the dark window, and listened to the rain. And in the rhythm of the drops he heard again the faint, imagined rattle of wheels on cobblestones, carrying with it the image of the woman at the window, pale and unblinking, her story still locked behind drawn curtains. The telegram from Dijon arrived just as the rain began again, drumming softly against the windows of the Quai des Orfèvres. Maigret had been sitting at his desk in shirt-sleeves, pipe between his teeth, listening to the monotonous ticking of the wall clock when the clerk entered, his hand damp from the weather, and placed the folded paper before him. He slit it open with the slow precision of habit. The message was brief, official, but its words carried the same weight that each new report seemed to gather. Stop. Carriage resembling earlier descriptions sighted near Dijon station. Stop. Witness reports woman inside. Stop. Curtains half drawn. Stop. The distance between Paris and Dijon was considerable, and the timing improbable. Unless there were two such carriages, two such women, it meant a pace of movement that defied ordinary explanation. Maigret read the telegram twice, then a third time, while the ash on his pipe grew long and crumbled onto the blotter. He felt the familiar heaviness in his chest, not fear, but the recognition that this case was stretching itself beyond the comfortable borders of police logic. He called in Lucas, who read the telegram with a skeptical grunt. "Superstition, patron," he said, though without conviction. "Every provincial gendarme has heard of the phantom carriage by now. They see what they want to see." Maigret only puffed and nodded, but his mind worked on another track. He had known Dijon in his younger years, remembered the station square with its cafes and waiting hansom cabs, the faces of travellers anxious between trains. He could picture it in fog, in rain, in the hush before dawn. And he could imagine, too vividly, the carriage drawing up there, the pale face at the window, staring out at the tracks as though expecting a departure that never came. By afternoon, he was on the telephone with the Dijon police, his deep voice steady, measured, asking questions whose answers he could anticipate before they were given. Yes, a carriage had been seen, black or perhaps dark green, the witness uncertain. Yes, there had been a woman visible behind the curtain, but she had not stirred. No, they had not taken down the license, nor followed the vehicle. It had disappeared as quietly as it had arrived, leaving behind only unease. Maigret thanked them, replaced the receiver, and sat motionless for a long while, the smoke of his pipe thick around him. That evening he left the quay earlier than usual, walking slowly across the Pont Neuf as drizzle turned the cobblestones slick. The river below reflected broken shards of light, the barges moored along the quays, rocking gently in the current. He paused at the balustrade, staring into the water, his hat pulled low against the rain. Dijon. Why Dijon? The city was neither particularly remote nor particularly central, yet its station connected to the south, to Lyon, to the borders beyond. It was a place of passage, of departure. And the thought came to him unbidden. Perhaps the carriage was not moving aimlessly, but tracing a route of stations, a path drawn along the spine of France. At home, Madame Maigret noticed his silence. She ladled soup into his bowl, placed bread beside him, and asked nothing. Her quiet presence was a comfort he rarely named. When at last he spoke, it was not of Dijon nor of telegrams, but of a memory from years earlier, a case in which a travelling salesman had vanished between Paris and Lyon, only to be found weeks later in a provincial hotel, his life dismantled by debts and secrets. She listened, hands folded on the table, and when he finished, she said softly, "You always find them, Jules, even when they do not wish to be found." He smiled faintly, kissed her cheek, and said no more. The following morning he summoned Janvier, gave him instructions to trace reports of carriages near stations, to follow the trail not only in Dijon, but wherever the rumour had spread. Janvier, eager as always, hurried off with a notebook and the restless energy of youth. Maigret remained, heavy and calm, waiting. He knew the rhythm of cases. Some advanced in leaps, others crawled, but all demanded patience. 2 days later, Janvier returned with fresh reports, a carriage in Sens, another near Fontainebleau. Each account was thin, coloured by imagination, but together they drew a line that could not be ignored. Maigret spread the notes across his desk, tracing the route with his thick finger. Southward, always southward, as if the carriage were following the rails themselves, shadowing the trains that ran toward Lyon and beyond. Yet what purpose lay in such a journey? To move unseen was simple enough. Paris offered anonymity in abundance. Why then parade a carriage through provinces where every station-master and gendarme could not help but notice? The logic eluded him, and the elusiveness itself troubled him more than the facts. He puffed hard on his pipe, the room filling with blue haze, and muttered to himself that the carriage was not merely a vehicle, but a message. Someone wanted to be seen, but not approached. That evening he dined again at home, though his mind remained elsewhere. Madame Maigret set before him a plate of roast chicken, its aroma warm and comforting, but he chewed without tasting. She watched him with quiet concern, then said, "It is not just a carriage, is it? There is more." He looked at her, heavy face softened by the lamp glow, and after a pause he admitted, "It feels larger than one woman behind a curtain." She nodded, said nothing more, and returned to her sewing, leaving him to his thoughts. Later, in his armchair, pipe glowing faintly, he considered the possibilities. A prisoner moved under cover of night, a woman concealed by force, or a woman complicit, veiled not by constraint but by choice, part of a scheme whose purpose lay beyond Parisian alleys. Each possibility twisted into another, none resolving into clarity. Near midnight, as the city lay hushed, he walked to the window and looked out. The rain had ceased, leaving the street slick and gleaming. In the distance he heard a faint rattle, the echo of wheels on stone. His heart gave a slow, heavy beat. For a moment he thought he saw lanterns gliding through the mist, a silhouette against the glow of a lamp. But when he blinked, the street was empty. Only silence remained, and the river flowing dark and steady beyond the quay. He returned to his chair, sat heavily, and relit his pipe. The telegram from Dijon lay on the desk, its words stark in the lamplight. He read them once more, though he knew them by heart, and whispered to himself, "Why Dijon? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the embers glowed and faded. Maigret knew the answer would come, but not yet. For now the carriage moved still, southward through the night, carrying its pale passenger from station to station, leaving behind nothing but rumour and the unease of those who glimpsed her. And he, Inspector Maigret, sat in Paris, waiting, pipe in hand, as though the fog itself might one night roll back to reveal the truth. That evening, after another day of reports, telegrams, and contradictions, Maigret returned home later than usual. The staircase smelled faintly of boiled cabbage from a neighbour's pot, and the landing was dim, the light bulb half burned out. Yet the moment he opened the door, the familiar warmth of his apartment wrapped itself around him. The glow of the lamp shaded with green glass, the faint aroma of stew simmering on the stove, and the quiet rustle of Madame Maigret moving about her domain. She looked up from the table where she was arranging cutlery and smiled, the kind of smile that restored, without effort, something in him the day had worn down. He hung his heavy coat, placed his hat on the peg, and sank into the chair near the window with the heaviness of a man carrying more than just his body. She did not ask at once. She had long since learned his rhythms, that the silence of his arrival was not a refusal, but a necessary interval, a space in which the day could settle before he crossed into the calm of home. She served the stew, ladled into deep bowls, and they ate quietly, the clink of spoons and the distant hum of the city forming the only background. After a while she said softly, "This carriage, you have thought of nothing else for days." He looked at her with the faintest flicker of surprise. He had mentioned it only in fragments, yet she knew. She always knew. He shrugged, took a long pull from his beer and muttered, "It is nothing clear yet. Only shadows." She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand, warm and steady. "But shadows can weigh as heavily as facts." Her voice was calm, without reproach, yet it carried a depth of understanding that made him lower his eyes. Later, when the dishes were cleared, and she sat with her sewing basket near the lamp, he lit his pipe and watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling. She sewed with slow precision, needle rising and falling, the thread glinting in the lamplight. It was in these quiet moments that her presence sharpened his thoughts, not by interrogation, but by the simplicity of her perspective. He began to speak, haltingly at first, then with greater flow, of the watchman's testimony, the rag-picker's unease, the café in Montmartre, the telegram from Dijon. He spoke of the woman's pale face, of her stillness, of the silence that seemed to follow the carriage like a second shadow. Madame Maigret listened without interruption, her hands steady on the cloth. When he paused, she asked a single question, gentle yet piercing. "And do you believe she is asking to be found, or asking to remain hidden?" He removed the pipe from his mouth, exhaled a long stream of smoke, and stared at her. It was not a question he had posed to himself. He had assumed she was a victim, passive, displayed like a doll. Yet now the alternative presented itself, that the woman might be complicit, or resigned, or bound by a duty deeper than fear. The ambiguity unsettled him, and yet it rang true. "You see her as prisoner," Madame Maigret continued, her voice low, "but perhaps she sits there by choice. There are prisons we enter ourselves." Her words lingered in the room long after she fell silent. He puffed slowly at his pipe, his heavy face unreadable, but inside him something shifted. He realized that in his reports, his notes, he had described her always as unmoving, pale, silent, but never as resisting. There had been no struggle, no gesture toward escape, only stillness and eyes fixed on something unseen. The clock struck 10. Outside, the city lay quiet, rain dripping steadily from the eaves. Madame Maigret set aside her sewing, folded it neatly, and said, "You will solve it, Jules. But perhaps not by looking only at her. Perhaps you must look at the man beside her, the one who drives the carriage, the one who chooses the road." He nodded slowly, struck by the simplicity of the suggestion. He had been fixated on the woman, her mystery, her stillness. But what of the man? What of the driver, the gentleman, the shadow who seemed always present but never described in detail? The case, he realized, was not only about the passenger, but about the unseen hand that steered the wheels. When at last they retired, he lay awake beside her, pipe extinguished, the darkness of the room pressing close. He thought of the carriage rolling through fog-bound streets, the woman's face at the window, and behind her, unseen, the presence of a man, foreign, wealthy, connected, perhaps ruthless. He thought, too, of the possibility that she was not merely his prisoner but his accomplice, her silence not forced but chosen. The thought unsettled him more deeply than any ghostly rumor. In the days that followed, he carried with him the echo of her words. At the quay, as telegrams continued to arrive, he began to ask different questions. Not only, who is she, but who commands the carriage? Not only, why does she not cry out? But what purpose does her silence serve? The answers did not come quickly, yet the shift in perspective altered the texture of his investigation. One afternoon, as he sat smoking heavily in his office, Janvier entered with fresh reports from the provinces. Maigret asked him abruptly, did any witness notice the driver, his face, his manner? Janvier blinked, shuffled his notes, and admitted that most had not looked. Their eyes had been drawn always to the woman, to her unsettling stillness. The driver had been a shadow, a silhouette, a forgettable presence. That, Maigret realized, was itself telling. To go unseen was often a matter of intention. That night, once more at home, he spoke of it to Madame Maigret. She listened, as she always did, quietly, her hands busy with knitting this time, her needles clicking softly in rhythm. When he finished, she said, "It is the man you must find. The woman will follow. She may not move, but he does. He chooses when the carriage stops, when it passes. Find him, and you will know her story." He sat in silence, humbled by the clarity of her thought. It was not police reasoning, not deduction, built on reports and testimonies, but something more intuitive, born of human observation. He realized, not for the first time, how much of his own success had been shaped by these quiet evenings, these reflections shared across the dinner table, where she guided his thoughts without ever seeming to. The rain continued outside, steady, insistent, washing the city in silver streaks. Maigret filled his pipe again, struck a match, and watched the flame flare and die. He felt the heaviness of the case upon him, but also a new steadiness, as though her words had anchored him against the fog. He leaned back in his chair, exhaled a plume of smoke, and said softly, almost to himself, "Yes, the man." And in the quiet that followed, Madame Maigret smiled faintly, bent her head over her knitting, and let the silence speak for both of them. The first time Maigret saw the story in print, it was in the evening edition of Le Matin, folded untidily on his desk when he returned from a meeting with the examining magistrate. The headline was modest, tucked between reports of a political scandal and a new theatre premiere, yet it carried with it a weight disproportionate to its size, La Dame au Carrosse Fantôme. Beneath it, a few paragraphs, half fact, half embroidery, spoke of a mysterious carriage gliding through Paris at night, its passenger a woman pale as wax, its driver unknown. The piece mentioned witnesses near the Pont Neuf, a rag picker in the Latin Quarter, even a station master in Dijon. The details were inconsistent, exaggerated, but the effect was immediate. The phantom carriage had leapt from rumour into public myth. By the next morning, every newspaper carried some version of the tale. Le Petit Parisien spoke of abduction, quoting anonymous sources who hinted at a vanished heiress. Le Journal preferred romance, suggesting a tragic liaison, a clandestine affair rolling through the fog. Even Le Figaro, with its air of superiority, could not resist printing a sardonic commentary, likening the carriage to an operatic apparition. Wherever Maigret turned, in cafes, on trams, in the corridors of the Palais de Justice, he heard the murmurs. Paris had seized the story with both hands, and now the city itself was conspiring in its retelling. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the effect was immediate. Clerks carried papers folded under their arms, pausing to speculate in low voices. Janvier arrived with Le Petit Parisien tucked openly in his pocket, shaking his head at the florid prose, yet secretly intrigued. Lucas muttered about journalists inventing what the police had not confirmed, but even he lingered longer than usual over the columns. Maigret said nothing. He sat at his desk, pipe clamped firmly in his teeth, reading each article with the same patient heaviness he gave to witness statements. For amid the exaggerations, he searched for what he always sought, the small, stubborn kernel of truth that rumour could not conceal. What struck him most was not the contradictions, but the unanimity of unease. Every article, whether mocking or melodramatic, lingered on the same detail: the woman at the window, motionless, eyes unblinking as though carved from ivory. It was this image, repeated and magnified, that had gripped the imagination of Paris. The carriage itself was only a vessel. The woman had become the ghost of the city. By afternoon, reporters began to appear at the quay itself, hats pulled low, notebooks ready. They crowded the entrance hall, peppered the clerks with questions, even dared to approach Maigret's office. He received them with the patience of a man who had endured worse storms. He offered no confirmations, no denials, only the heavy silence of his presence. Yet he understood the danger. Once the press claimed a case, it ceased to belong solely to the police. The city itself became investigator, judge, and storyteller. And rumour, once printed, was harder to dispel than fact. That evening, walking home through the drizzle, he paused outside a kiosk where the day's editions fluttered in the damp wind. Their headlines shouted variations of the same theme. The phantom carriage haunts Paris. Is she a victim or a runaway? Mystery lady, seen again in Dijon. Passers-by lingered to read, their faces animated with curiosity, with fear, with delight. He lit his pipe, watched the smoke drift into the mist, and thought grimly that the carriage had ceased to be a simple enigma. It was now a spectacle, a mirror in which the city saw what it wished: scandal, romance, tragedy. At supper, Madame Maigret unfolded her own newspaper, shaking her head at the exaggerations. "They make her into a ghost," she said softly, "but ghosts do not leave telegrams." He smiled faintly at her pragmatism, yet her words struck him, for indeed each telegram, each report was real enough, ink on paper, testimony given by living men. It was not a phantom he pursued, but a flesh-and-blood carriage rolling through the streets, commanded by a hand unseen. The press, with its fantasies, threatened to obscure that reality. In the following days, the fever only grew. L'Intransigeant published a supposed interview with a café singer who claimed to have ridden in the carriage herself, escaping only by leaping into the street. The tale was absurd, embroidered with melodrama, yet it sold papers by the thousands. In Montmartre, posters appeared depicting a veiled woman at a carriage window, advertising a hastily written review titled La Dame du Carrosse. The story had slipped its leash. It belonged now to Parisian imagination, no longer to the measured notes of police dossiers. Maigret moved heavily through it all, pipe smoke wreathing his head, listening more than speaking. He sensed that the frenzy might serve him as much as it hindered. For in the noise of exaggeration true witnesses might step forward, eager to correct the lies. Already one such man had appeared, a railway clerk from Sens, who, troubled by what he read, presented himself at the quay to report what he had actually seen. His account was modest, precise, stripped of flourish, a dark carriage, a still woman, silence in its wake. No more, no less. To Maigret such plainness was gold, and yet the danger remained. The more Paris imagined, the more it distorted. He worried that the woman herself, whether victim or accomplice, might be consumed by the myth, her true identity lost beneath layers of invention. He thought again of her pale face, of Madame Maigret's quiet words. Is she asking to be found, or to remain hidden? The city, in its hunger, had decided she must be found, must be dragged into light, must become a spectacle. But Maigret, heavy and cautious, knew that truth was rarely so obliging. One night, unable to sleep, he walked the streets near the river. The kiosks were shuttered now, the papers stacked behind iron grates, their headlines still visible in the lamplight. The mystery deepens, one proclaimed. Carriage seen again near Lyon, shouted another. He stood there, collar raised against the chill, pipe cold between his teeth, staring at the words until they blurred. It was as though the city itself had conspired to weave a net around him, pressing him toward a solution not yet ready to reveal itself. Returning home, he found Madame Maigret waiting with a lamp turned low. She looked up from her hair book and said simply, "You walk like a man followed by ghosts." He smiled tiredly, kissed her cheek, and sat down to relight his pipe. "Not ghosts," he murmured, "just wheels without sound." She nodded, and they let the silence stretch between them, comfortable, steady, anchoring him against the storm of rumour that swirled outside their walls. The next morning, on his desk at the quay, lay yet another telegram, this one from Lyon. The carriage had been seen again, near the station square, the woman's pale face unmistakable. Maigret stared at the words, the smoke from his pipe curling around them, and thought grimly that the newspapers would have a feast. But for him, the case was no longer about rumour nor spectacle. It was about a line traced southward across France, a path that led somewhere, though he could not yet see where. And he knew, with the slow certainty that guided him, that the carriage would not vanish until it had completed its design. The train pulled out of the Gare de Lyon beneath a sky the colour of tin, the rain sheeting across the glass in quick bursts, then fading as the suburbs gave way to flat countryside. Maigret sat heavily in his compartment, pipe unlit, watching the blurred landscape pass. Telegraph poles flicked rhythmically by. Villages appeared like grey smudges behind dripping trees, and every so often the whistle of the locomotive echoed across fields soaked with autumn rain. He had not chosen lightly to leave Paris. His cases rarely pulled him from the Seine, from the smoky cafes and damp alleys he knew so well. But the trail of the carriage seemed to demand it, pointing steadily southward, from Dijon to Lyon, through stations where its shadow had been reported, leaving behind not facts but impressions, rumours, a chill in the memory of those who saw it. He travelled alone. Janvier had wanted to accompany him, eager to stretch his legs in the provinces, but Maigret preferred solitude. He carried a small valise, no more, and a sheaf of telegrams folded in his pocket. Each telegram was terse, stripped of embellishment, yet together they traced a line that had become impossible to ignore. As the train thundered onward, Maigret leaned back, eyes half closed, and felt the peculiar weight of distance. Paris was far now, its foggy quays and murmuring cafes replaced by wet fields and provincial routes. Yet the mystery travelled with him, as persistent as the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails. At Dijon, the rain had ceased, leaving the station square damp and shining under gas lamps. He stepped down from the train, pipe now glowing faintly, and looked around with his slow, heavy gaze. The station smelled of coal smoke and wet stone, of suitcases dragged across the platform. A gendarme met him with the stiff courtesy of provincial authority, cap polished, moustache carefully waxed. They walked together across the square to the small café, where the station master had first spoken of the carriage. The café smelled of coffee gone bitter on the stove and damp wool steaming near the stove. The station master, a man with weathered cheeks and eyes bleary from long hours, repeated his account with weary precision. The carriage had appeared just before dawn, rolling slowly across the square, the woman's face faintly visible through the half-drawn curtain. It had lingered as if waiting, then turned away without stopping. No license noted, no horses described in detail, only the impression of silence, of stillness. Maigret asked his questions patiently, the colour of the lamps, the sound of the hooves, the direction taken. The answers were vague, hesitant. But what mattered to him was the tone. The man spoke with the flat certainty of one who did not wish to embroider. He had seen something, and though he could not explain it, he could not deny it. That was enough for Maigret, who scribbled a few lines in his notebook, more to mark the cadence of the man's words than the content. He spent the evening walking the streets of Dijon, heavy steps echoing against shuttered shop fronts, pipe smoke trailing behind him. The city smelled of wet stone and faint wine, of kitchens shuttered for the night. He imagined the carriage moving through these same streets, the pale woman staring from behind her curtain, unnoticed by most, but indelible to those who caught her gaze. The thought unnerved him, though he showed no sign. From Dijon he travelled further, to smaller towns whose names passed quickly on railway schedules, Châlons, Mâcon, Villefranche. At each he found some fragment, some hint of the carriage's passage. A station porter swore he had seen it waiting by the edge of the yard, the driver cloaked and silent. An innkeeper remembered a gentleman who paid too well for a glass of wine, his accent faintly foreign, his eyes cold. A farmer's wife insisted she had glimpsed the pale face at a crossroads, staring out with such intensity that she dropped her basket. Each account was incomplete, coloured by imagination, yet together they formed a pattern too steady to dismiss. At night, in provincial hotels that smelled of damp plaster and soap, Maigret sat at small wooden tables with his notes spread before him. The wallpaper was faded, the lamps flickered, and the pipes rattled with the passing of water. He smoked slowly, glass of wine untouched at his elbow, and traced the route again and again, southward always, as if the carriage pursued some invisible itinerary, a pilgrimage whose destination remained hidden. He felt less investigator than Shadow himself, following a phantom across the spine of France. Yet amid the vagueness, one detail persisted, immutable, the woman at the window. She was always described the same way, pale, unmoving, expressionless, as if suspended between life and death. It was not the kind of invention that rumour multiplied. It was too consistent, too stubborn. The city might embroider, the provinces might exaggerate, but the image remained intact. And that, Maigret knew, was the heart of the case. In Lyon he found the press waiting, notebooks ready, eager for statements. He gave none. He walked past them in silence, his heavy step unhurried, his pipe clenched between his teeth. He met with the commissaire of the city police, exchanged the courtesies of one professional to another, and listened, without comment, to the latest reports. Again the carriage had been seen near the station, again at dawn, again vanishing without trace. Each telling was the same, yet maddeningly incomplete. That night he walked along the Rhône, its dark waters swollen with rain, barges shifting against their moorings. The city spread around him in yellow pools of lamplight, cafes buzzing, yet he felt a peculiar solitude, as though he alone carried the weight of the carriage's journey. He leaned against the balustrade, pipe smoke curling upward, and thought again of Madame Maigret's quiet words. Look at the man beside her. He chooses the road. It was the man he sought now, the shadow who commanded the route, who left the woman to haunt the imagination of witnesses, while he himself remained unseen. He returned to his hotel, climbed the narrow stairwell, and sat in the small room with its iron bed and thin curtains. He wrote in his notebook, not phantom, pattern of stations, southward always, driver unseen, passenger unforgettable, woman as signal, man as purpose. He stared at the words until the ink blurred. Then he set the pen down, extinguished his pipe, and sat in darkness listening to the distant rattle of a carriage that might have been real, or might have been only the echo of his thoughts. By morning the rain had returned, beating against the window panes as he packed his valise. He would return to Paris, for he sensed that the trail, though leading outward, would circle back. The provinces had offered fragments, glimpses, reflections. The truth, he felt, remained at the centre, where the river cut through the fog and the city whispered in cafes. Yet he carried with him now a certainty. The carriage was no legend, no invention of rumour. It was deliberate, purposeful, moving across France with a destination not yet revealed. As the train pulled out of Lyon, Maigret sat heavily once more, pipe unlit, eyes fixed on the streaming countryside. He was weary, yet within that weariness burned a steady resolve. The carriage rolled still, somewhere on the roads beyond his sight, and he would follow it, whether by telegram, by rumour, or by the faintest trace of wheels on wet stone, until at last it stopped. And when it did, he knew the silence it carried would give way to a truth heavier than any rumour Paris had imagined. Back in Paris the case had changed its shape. The carriage was no longer simply a rumour gliding through fog, nor only a pale face haunting the imagination of witnesses. The journey through the provinces had traced its arc, and when Maigret returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, weary from train smoke and damp hotels, he carried with him the growing certainty that there was a man, an architect of the silence, a presence as deliberate as the woman was passive. She was the visible surface, the bait for the eye. He was the shadow, the hand guiding the wheels, the decision behind every turn. The first hint of his outline came not from police reports but from whispers at the edges of society. A journalist from Le Journal hinted, in a column half hidden among theatre gossip, that a foreign gentleman of considerable refinement and reserve had been seen in company with the phantom carriage. The words were vague, chosen to titillate rather than inform, but they stirred in Maigret the echo of what he had heard in Montmartre, the well-dressed stranger, courteous yet cold, who paid too much for too little, leaving behind a sense of unease. Janvier brought him more. A concierge in the Marais spoke of a man who arrived at odd hours, never alone, never carrying luggage, but always stepping into a waiting carriage. He was tall, with hair carefully brushed, his suits impeccably pressed. He spoke French fluently, but with the faint precision of a foreign education. The concierge had not dared to ask questions. The man paid punctually, too punctually, and the coins left in his palm felt heavy enough to still suspicion. Maigret listened to these fragments, pipe smoke thick around him, his heavy face unreadable. In his notes he began to write not of the carriage, not of the woman, but of the man. He gave him no name yet, only titles: the gentleman, the shadow behind the curtain. He pictured him seated opposite the pale woman, his gloved hands folded on his knee, his eyes not on her, but on the world beyond the glass, as though measuring the distance of their passage. At the quay, Lucas scoffed. A gentleman? A prince, perhaps, or an ambassador's ghost, patron? Paris loves to invent. But Maigret shook his head slowly. Not invention, he muttered. Design. For he had felt it in the provinces, the deliberate arc of the journey, the choice of stations, the consistency of silence. No man wandered so widely without purpose. One evening, near the Boulevard Haussmann, Maigret himself caught a glimpse that confirmed his instincts. He had been walking slowly through the drizzle, pipe glowing faintly, when a carriage turned the corner ahead, wheels muffled by wet stones. Its lamps glimmered weakly, its horses steaming in the damp. For an instant the curtain shifted, and he saw not the woman's pale face, but the darker outline of a man seated opposite her. The glimpse was brief, but it was enough. Tall, broad-shouldered, posture erect, his face in shadow, yet the impression of authority undeniable. Then the curtain fell back, and the carriage rolled on, swallowed by the mist. Maigret did not hurry after it. He stood beneath a lamp-post, letting the smoke drift from his pipe, his heart steady. He knew he had seen not a phantom, but flesh and blood, and that recognition was more valuable than pursuit, for pursuit would have ended in another disappearance, another silence. But the certainty of the man's presence altered the case irrevocably. In the following days, whispers multiplied. A waiter in a discreet restaurant near the Madeleine remembered serving fine Burgundy to a foreign gentleman who dined with a veiled lady. A bookseller on the quay claimed to have sold rare volumes to a man whose description matched. Each account was fragmentary, unreliable in detail, yet together they wove a portrait of a man who moved easily between worlds, too elegant to be dismissed as criminal, too reserved to be embraced as socialite. Maigret sat at his desk, heavy shoulders bent, staring at the mosaic forming before him. He remembered Madame Maigret's quiet words. Find the man, and you will know the woman. It was true, the woman's silence had been her mask, but the man's movements betrayed intention. He thought of the way she had been displayed, framed in the window like an icon. It was not concealment, but advertisement. Someone wanted her to be seen, and her stillness was part of the performance. The man, by contrast, slipped behind the curtain, unseen, his presence known only by inference. He was the author of the spectacle. At night, walking home across the Pont Neuf, Maigret felt the weight of the city pressing in. Paris was buzzing with the story, newspapers inventing more each day, cafes humming with speculation. Some called the man a prince in exile, others a banker ruined by scandal, others still a spy moving under diplomatic cover. The truth lay hidden among these fantasies, but Maigret knew it was simpler, heavier. He had felt it in the set of the man's shoulders, in the silence of his passing, not romance, not melodrama, but something colder, graver. He began to search discreetly through records, through embassies and consulates, through lists of foreign dignitaries and wealthy exiles. He spoke to informants in cafes where politics and gossip intertwined, to innkeepers who remembered more than they admitted. Always the same shadow emerged, a man of means, a man whose money smoothed over suspicion, whose accent slipped between borders, a man who might command a carriage to glide through Paris as if the streets belonged to him. And always, beside him, the woman. She did not resist, did not call for help. Her stillness was not only resignation but collusion, perhaps. Or perhaps she was bound by ties invisible. Debt, duty, fear. Maigret could not tell, but he knew that her silence was the veil through which the man concealed his purpose. One evening, after hours of reading dossiers in the stale air of his office, Maigret walked home later than usual. Madame Maigret was waiting with supper kept warm, her quiet smile steady. He sat heavily, ate without appetite, and finally said aloud what had been circling in his thoughts. "It is the man I must find. The woman is only the window." She nodded, as though she had known all along. Later, as he sat in his armchair with his pipe, he thought of the man behind the curtain, his gloved hands, his shadowed face, his posture so certain. A gentleman, yes, but of what sort? The kind whose refinement concealed cruelty, or the kind whose wealth cloaked desperation? He did not yet know, but he felt, with the slow certainty that guided him, that when the carriage finally stopped, it would be the man who explained the silence, not the woman. And he resolved, as the embers of his pipe glowed in the dark, that he would be there when it did. The day it ended was one of those damp Paris evenings when the fog seemed to rise not only from the river but from the very stones themselves, wrapping the city in a shroud that blurred distance and muffled sound. Maigret had been at the Quai des Orfèvres since dawn, heavy with the knowledge that the trail could not go on indefinitely. Telegrams had mapped a journey from Paris to Dijon, from Dijon to Lyon, and back again toward the capital. Always southward, always returning. It was as though the carriage had traced a great circle, a ritual passage with Paris at its centre. And now, by some instinct he could not quite name, Maigret knew the circle was about to close. At dusk a message arrived from a night patrol on the left bank. The carriage had been seen again, moving slowly along the Boulevard Saint-Germain, its wheels silent as ever, its lamps glowing faintly in the mist. The patrol had followed at a distance, but it turned sharply onto Rue des Saints-Pères and vanished. Maigret rose without a word, his pipe already extinguished, and took his hat. He did not summon Janvier or Lucas. He went alone. The streets glistened with damp, gas lamps glowing like pale moons behind the veil of fog. His steps were heavy, deliberate, yet his senses sharpened. He moved through alleys where the air smelled of coal smoke and wet plaster, past cafes where voices murmured behind steamed windows, until at last he heard it, the faint rattle of wheels, so soft it might have been imagined. He followed the sound, pipe clenched between his teeth, until the shape emerged, a dark carriage, lanterns swaying gently, horses steaming in the chill. This time it did not glide past. This time it halted. The carriage stood before an old hotel particulier, its façade dim and crumbling, shutters drawn against the night. The horses stamped impatiently, their breath rising like smoke. The driver remained a shadow, motionless on his seat. And there, behind the curtain, the woman, pale as always, face expressionless, eyes unblinking. Yet there was something different, a faint tremor of breath on the glass, a shift so subtle that only Maigret's long hours of watching made him certain it was real. He approached slowly, the fog wrapping around him, the street silent save for the restless horses. He felt no haste, no surge of triumph, only the heaviness of inevitability. At last the carriage door opened. A man stepped down, tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed. His face, now visible in the lamplight, bore the smoothness of wealth, the confidence of one accustomed to command. His eyes, dark and steady, met Maigret's without flinching. There was no fear in them, only a weary acknowledgment, as though he had expected this encounter. "Inspector," the man said softly, his French precise, touched by the faintest foreign cadence. "You have followed us far." Maigret did not answer at once. He looked at the man, then at the woman still seated inside, her pale face framed by the curtain. She did not move, did not speak. Only her eyes flickered briefly, meeting his before turning away. That glance contained more than all the telegrams and reports: sorrow, resignation, and a silence deeper than words. "Who is she?" Maigret asked finally, his voice low, steady. The man's lips curved in something between a smile and a grimace. "She's my wife." The words fell into the fog like stones into water, rippling outward. Maigret studied him, his pipe cold between his teeth, his breath clouding in the night. The man continued, his tone calm, almost confessional. She had been ill for years, he said, confined by a condition neither doctor nor cure could relieve. Her life had become one of shadows, rooms shuttered against the world. Yet she longed to see France again, to feel the movement of the road, the shifting of towns and stations. So he had given her that. Night after night they travelled, circling through Paris, through Dijon, through Lyon, always returning, always hidden. "She cannot bear the light of day," he said softly. "But she can bear the night, the silence. It is her only freedom." The explanation was simple, human, yet it carried with it a weight of tragedy. Maigret looked again at the woman. Her stillness was not the stillness of terror, but of exhaustion, of a life pared down to survival. The pale face at the window was no apparition, no ghostly prisoner, but a woman clinging to the only semblance of motion left to her. And yet there was the man. His wealth had bought discretion, his refinement had cloaked eccentricity, but his determination had turned his wife into a spectacle, a moving legend. He had let her be seen, knowing she would be noticed, knowing rumour would follow. Whether through pride or defiance or some darker impulse, he had allowed her silence to haunt the imagination of the city. Maigret felt the weight of judgment pressing on him. Was there a crime? No law forbade a man from driving his ailing wife through the streets at night. No statute punished silence or the unsettling of witnesses. And yet something in him rebelled at the manipulation, the cruelty disguised as devotion. He thought of the watchmen, the rag-pickers, the clerks, all left with the chill of that passing face. He thought of Paris itself, caught in the net of rumour, restless with unease. The man watched him steadily, as though awaiting a verdict. Maigret drew deeply on his pipe, though it had long gone cold, and exhaled into the fog. Finally he said, "It cannot continue." The man inclined his head, neither surprised nor indignant. "No," he said quietly, "it cannot." He turned back to the carriage, helped the woman down. She stood unsteadily, veiled now, leaning on his arm. Together they entered the Hotel Particulier, its door closing softly behind them. The carriage remained, empty, the horses shifting as though confused by their release. Maigret stood in the street a long time, pipe hanging from his lips, listening to the silence that followed. It was the same silence that had haunted the city for weeks, yet now it felt different, not threatening but spent, the silence of something concluded. The carriage had stopped, and with it the restless unease of Paris would fade, replaced soon enough by new scandals, new mysteries. He walked back slowly along the quays, the fog curling around him, the river flowing dark beside him. His heavy step echoed on the wet stones. He thought of the woman's eyes meeting his, for that brief instant, the sorrow in them, the resignation. He thought, too, of Madame Maigret waiting at home with her quiet patience, her steady gaze. He felt the contrast keenly, one life spent in stillness, another in quiet strength. When he reached his apartment, she was there as always, lamp turned low, book set aside. She looked up, saw the heaviness in his face, and asked no questions. He sat, removed his coat, and lit his pipe. The smoke curled upward, carrying with it the last traces of the carriage's silence. "It is finished," he said softly. She nodded, poured him a glass of beer, and returned to her chair. The clock ticked steadily, the city outside muffled by fog. Maigret sat in his armchair, pipe glowing faintly, and felt the case slip away, leaving behind only its echo. The pale face at the window, the gentleman behind the curtain, the carriage that never stopped, until at last it did. And Paris, restless as ever, turned the page, its secrets returning to the fog.